About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Welcome to Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and through this series of programs, I'm explaining some of the ideas and experiments and introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, which is ruth@noeticmoments.org. Well, those of you who've heard earlier shows may remember that we generally have two ways of thinking about consciousness. In the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is being awake and aware, knowing what's going on. In the field of noetics, though, as it's emerged over the last 100 years or so, consciousness is much, much more. It's products and processes of the mind, both in our awareness and outside of it, but it's also profound experiences that human beings have, and ultimately, consciousness, in noetic terms, is what connects us all. So far in this series, we've looked at what the mind is and how it works. We started with Sigmund Freud, who opened the door to understanding the processes of mind at the scientific bent in the early 1900s. And then Carl Jung's ideas from the 1920s to the 50s, relating individual consciousness to a collective consciousness. Then I took you to Charles Tart's 1960s work on the states of consciousness, each with their own physiological, emotional, and mental characteristics. And then we looked at Julian Jaynes, who in the 1980s related consciousness to the separation of the right and left hemispheres of our brain. I then introduced some of the field models of the mind that have been developed by Sheldrake, Levine, and others through the 1950s to 90s, and then we began to consider how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness with the works of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and others in the 1980s and 90s. We looked at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and Ervin Laszlo in the next episode. And last week, we explored quantum mechanics professor Amit Goswami's monistic idealism, describing the quantum basis for the one consciousness that he says is the basis of all reality. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives, which you access by clicking on the little cloud up in the banner, or on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to clips and books and authors that I mention. Today, we're going to step away from the hard sciences of physics and biology and return to the field of psychology, which, after all, is defined as the scientific study of the human mind and its functions, especially those affecting behavior in a given context. So while Freud and Jung and their colleagues can be said to have founded the field, many, many other researchers have continued the work and developed far more methods and frameworks. In the process, they've created new branches and areas of focus. But basically, there are two main fields of psychology: clinical psychology, applying principles and methods in a therapeutic setting, and research psychology, developing and testing hypotheses about the nature of mind and behavior. And within these, there are several focus areas, including social psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, evolutionary psychology, forensic psychology, health psychology, neuropsychology, occupational psychology, and two other large categories, humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. Now, what is it? Well, in her 2009 book, Eyes Wide Open, Cultivating Discernment on the Spiritual Path, Mariana Kaplan wrote, transpersonal psychologists attempt to integrate timeless wisdom with modern Western psychology and translate spiritual principles into scientifically grounded contemporary language. Transpersonal psychology addresses the full spectrum of human psycho-spiritual development, from our deepest wounds and needs to the existential crisis of the human being, to the most transcendent capacities of our consciousness. So that's Mariana Kaplan looking back on 30-plus years of development. The transpersonal psychology movement was begun in the late 1960s by the famous humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow as an attempt to establish what he called a fourth force in the field. He was following the psychodynamic, the early work, the behaviorist, that B.F. Skinner and his friends, who continue to be very powerful in the movement, from the 50s and forward, the humanistic approaches that began to emerge in the 50s and was very strong in the 60s, and in his words, to explore the, quote, farther reaches of human nature in this fourth force. Now, initially, of course, transpersonal psychology was strongly influenced by the human potential movement and the counterculture movements, and all of their psycho-experimentation, including psychedelic substances, meditation, and other consciousness-changing practices, were an attempt to understand the different states of consciousness and the different views of reality, which were revealed through similar experiences and this experimentation. At the same time, transpersonal psychology was an attempt to integrate the ideas and insights of Western psychology with the ideas and insights of the Eastern spiritual traditions, such as Buddhism and Hindu Vedanta and yoga. Particularly, transpersonal psychologists were interested in those spiritual paths' treatment of higher states of consciousness and higher stages of human development. Hence, the idea of psycho-spiritual development, which transpersonal psychologists tend to work with. A few areas of their research interest include Abraham Maslow's peak experiences. Where do they come from? How do they happen? What are the consequences? And also guided imagery and visualization. If you've encountered Shakti Gawain's creative visualization or Jean Houston and Robert Masters' mind games, you have encountered some of that work. Transpersonal psychology also is interested in near-death experiences, music therapy, parapsychological experiences, the experiences and the processes of meditation, including mindfulness, and the various spiritual practices and their effects on psychological states and development. So clearly, transpersonal psychology is seeking to incorporate a very broad range of ideas, disciplines, and theories to address subjects outside of traditional psychology, research, and treatments. For example, as Steve Taylor wrote in Psychology Today back in 2015, quote, in Freudian psychology, awakening experiences are treated as a form of regression back to the state of oneness and well-being which we experienced in our mother's womb or early childhood. Psychiatrists and neuropsychologists, coming from the traditional point of view, tend to see these awakening experiences as a kind of aberration caused by some unusual neurological functioning. Transpersonal psychology is different in that it views these states not as aberrational, but as revelatory. not as subnormal, but as supernormal, as a glimpse of a more intense reality rather than an illusory one. Transpersonal psychologists believe that they bring significant insights into our true nature and into reality itself, and offer a glimpse of our potential as human beings. And that was in Psychology Today. The link will be on our website. The Institute of Transpersonal Psychology was founded in the late 1970s and is now called the Sophia University. It's graduated hundreds of therapists and researchers in those years, and many of them have gone on to be faculty at or even founders of other transpersonal institutes around the world. The Association of Transpersonal Psychology was formed also during that time. The association's website goes on to say, quote, recognizing the reciprocity inherent between our actions and our world, the association is dedicated to encouraging and enhancing practices and perspectives that will lead to a conscious, sustainable coevolution of culture, nature, and society. During the 1970s, when I was active in the association, Francis Vaughan and Roger Walsh were among the major names leading the organization. And soon after, Stanislav Grof, the author of the practice called holonomic breathwork, was the major leader in the association. And then through the 1990s, James Fadiman was a major figure. I'm going to let him tell you more about the association.
We see as central to understanding ourselves over these years of transpersonal have been moved from kind of ridiculed fringe to mainstream. Yoga. Now, yoga, as you know, has been primarily dumbed down as a way to stay slim for skinny women in spandex. However, and this was very interesting, however, what's happening now is some yoga classes are saying, what is yoga actually about? Where does it come from? What's the underlying philosophy? And so I'm seeing yoga teachers able now to reintroduce the spiritual system of which yoga is embedded. And that is an exciting kind of second round, like second wave feminism. Well, second wave yoga is going to look a lot like original yoga. Similarly, meditation, certainly it's been sliced and diced and sold in boxes. And mindfulness is this kind of current term, and mindfulness has gained in spread and utility and value. But again, what happens eventually is people say, is there anything other than mindfulness? Does this come from anything? Is this, and then the deeper system that we know it originates from emerges, and of course mindfulness is one of many, many, many ways to train the mind. And the neurochemistry people are now saying, actually when you continually do a practice, that your brain actually adjusts to the practice, just as, if you lift weights with with your arm eventually adjusts to that by developing more muscle. So that meditation, again, what happens for a lot of the things we're interested in, until the materialists can find some way to tie it to measurable physiology, it's really hard for them to take it in. Acupuncture, again, floundered, not because it didn't have 3,000 or 4,000 years of research, but because it didn't have something that Westerners could feel comfortable. And then you got endorphins, and then and so forth and so on, so that things that we're interested in are becoming mainstream. And certainly holotropic breathwork is one of those, which is, the nice thing about holotropic breathwork is people get better. And eventually, even the health systems are beginning to realize that people getting better isn't a bad thing. Now, I'm not saying about the pharmacological system, because they really don't want people to get better, but more and more people, also more and more physicians turn out to also want to be healthier too. It's not a great health profession. So visualization, affirmation, self-healing, all this, I would say, are our successes.
And that was James Fadiman, one of the major leaders in the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, speaking at a 2014 global symposium that was actually held in Russia. Some of his books, if you haven't heard of him, have to do with, the full range of what transpersonal psychology is about. He wrote a book called Essential Sufism. He wrote a book, Your Symphony of Selves, Discover and Understand More of Who We Are. He wrote Personality and Personal Growth with Robert Frager, The Other Side of Hate, as in Haight-Ashbury. And most recently, people have been interested in his work having to do with microdosing. Perhaps his first book was Exploring Madness, and then Transpersonal Education soon after that. So he's done a lot of work in the field and is an appropriate spokesman. All right. So how is all that related to our understanding of what consciousness is and the research around it? The underlying assumption in the very word transpersonal is that human minds are connected, at the very least, with other human minds and potentially with something that transcends humanity. Now, this is consistent with Jung's model and that of all the field theorists and quantum physicists we've explored so far, and it is the fundamental assumption on which all the research papers, conferences, and therapies have been developed by members of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology. Transpersonal psychologists use the techniques of meditation and visualization, as well as shamanic practices gleaned from other cultures, in working with their clients, and often use archetypal images, including those described by Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, to help people understand the ways their mind is working now. So one could say that the field of transpersonal psychology is the practical application of the model of consciousness that has been developed in and among the noetic sciences. Which brings me to the book review portion of the program. One of our listeners, and a volunteer here at KXCR, was delighted to discover that she was reading Edgar Mitchell's autobiography, The Way of the Explorer, at the time this show was first broadcast. We both delighted in the synchronicity, which term is, in fact, one of the discoveries that Mitchell describes in his book. The word synchronicity is much simpler than it sounds. S-Y-N means with in Greek, and chronos, C-H-R-O-N-O-S, is time. A synchronicity, as Carl Jung defined it, is an experience of two events occurring close together in time that are not physically causally connected, but are connected through their meaning. So her reading a book and then hearing it on the radio show at the same time was an unusual synchronicity. Edgar Mitchell began to experience many synchronicities like this after his return from the moon in 1973. And they were part of the reason that he sought scientific research to explain such things. And not finding much, after years of exploring research papers and journals and talking with scientists, he finally felt impelled to launch the Institute of Noetic Sciences to fill the gap. His story is remarkable. I gave highlights in our first episode, but in the book we get details on his childhood on a West Texas farm using horse-drawn equipment during the Dust Bowl years, through adolescence in Roswell, New Mexico, where he and his neighbors could see the mushroom clouds of the first atomic bomb tests over the mountains. And then he joined the military, and he became a pilot in the military, and he shares some of his experiences there. And toward the end of that career, he was able to study physics and computer engineering, earning his PhD at MIT with a dissertation describing a possible flight path to the moon. He was on course. He did land a job at NASA and finally was invited to be part of the astronaut program and ultimately did fly to the moon in Apollo 14. Phew, quite a life. And that was only the first half of it. But those experiences brought up many questions which his academic studies did not answer. And the more he explored, the more he was convinced that there is a profound connection between human beings and the rest of the universe, and that we're all capable of far more than we've been led to believe. Now, those of you who remember the 70s may be interested to know that he was instrumental in having Uri Geller tested scientifically. Both Uri's ability to bend spoons and his ability to know where something was and what it said. Those experiments then helped Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff define the remote viewing project, which later was adopted by the CIA and the U.S. Army. And you can learn a little bit about that in a fun way in the movie with George Clooney, Men Who Stared at Goats. Others of you may be interested in Mitchell's experiments with J.B. Rhine's telepathy symbols while in the capsule returning from the moon. Like all autobiographies, it's delightful to get to know the person through his words, his thoughts, and his feelings as they're expressed. And as in all autobiographies, one is always left wanting to know more. But if you're at all interested in knowing more about this field of study, reading The Way of the Explorer by Edgar Mitchell and Dwight Williams will be helpful and entertaining. And over the weeks to come, we'll take a look at others of the many books written on aspects of this science, and we'll try to keep up with the new titles as they come out. If you know of a book or video you'd like me to address, send an email to me at ruth@noeticmoments.org. Or if you're in Florence, you could drop it off at KXCR radio station. It's across from the library on 9th Street, and I'll take a look at it. Now, that book, as with all the others I mentioned, is linked on our website, noeticmoments.org. Ah, that sound tells me it's time to shift gears again. Today, since it was part of Mitchell's experience, I thought I'd share with you another application of the noetic sciences, the process of remote viewing. As I said in the description of transpersonal psychology and in Mitchell's story, we are all capable of far more than we've been allowed to experience in our culture. And the ability to see something without, quote, laying eyes on it, is one of the skills that almost anyone can develop, at least to some extent. It's not really that unusual for humans to do this. In other cultures, knowing where the herds are or what dangers might be ahead and whether someone of importance was arriving were all essential to survival. And many cases have been documented by anthropologists and historians. The setup at Stanford Research Institute in the 70s was designed as an experimental facility that controlled as many variables as possible. Subjects would sit in a Faraday cage, which no electronic or magnetic or even physical action could penetrate, and be given a sheet of paper with a set of coordinates that were encoded so that the person who gave them to the subject did not know what coordinates those were on the planet. Then the subject would be invited to draw, using their visual sense, and later describe, in narrative, whatever images came to them. Some people, like Uri Geller, were amazing, right on target, constantly and consistently. Others were vague, or mixed random thoughts with the image, or only got small parts of the whole picture. But virtually everyone got something. And when several people were given the same coordinates, what emerged was usually a very detailed drawing of the site in question. Can we learn what they did? Well, there's a guy named Glenn Wheaton, and if you're a listener on Coast to Coast AM, you've heard him before. He has a website, and he is the founder of the Hawaii Remote Viewers Group. His website is hrvg.org. Glenn says that the only way to test whether you can remote view is to remote view. So he gave us some instructions that we can follow. Step 1, make your mind an empty rice bowl. This first step is learning how to empty your mind of as much of the thoughts, images, and awareness that are normally part of your consciousness as you possibly can. Of course, you're never going to completely empty your mind. You're going to hear yourself breathing. There'll be an image of someone or something flitting before you. You'll hear something. But over several weeks or months, as a form of meditation, you become pretty good at creating a space in which nothing is happening. For now, you can just relax. You can close your eyes and breathe deeply and empty your mind. Now, one way to do that is you can see your mind as a bowl that is being emptied, and or you can focus on a window in front of you, which is dark, a black window into which you can gaze. This is the window you're going to look through to see what it is that you're about to see. Now, our imaginations are very active, so if you're looking at this black window, the mind is going to say, oh, I got to put something there. You've been doing that all of your life. But now, more than anything, you really want to be aware of the images the imagination is putting into your mind. If you see something familiar, like an image of your first grade teacher, she's not likely to be the viewing target. Just let her go by. Any very vivid image, probably imagination, not remote viewing, because remote viewed images tend to be somewhat blurred and indistinct, especially at first. So if you can identify the image, it's probably not remote viewing the target. You will see indistinct profiles and shapes, maybe colors. They'll not generally look like something you can name. When you start getting those fuzzy images, don't try to name them. Don't try to fill in the blanks. You just want to have the impressions as they are showing up. Take about 5 minutes as you're testing. Now, usually one receives the target coordinates or identifiers one at a time. You can do so on their website, hrvg.org, or you can have a friend put onto sheets of paper some code that refers to something that would ultimately be what you're attempting to see. And then allow yourself to draw those. Don't try to describe them with narrative. That will take you out of that state of consciousness. Draw whatever comes up in that vague, blurry kind of wondering way, and then go on to the next one. Don't give up just the first time that you try. So that's the essence of the practice of remote viewing, at least testing to see whether it's something that you have a greatly enhanced skill or just a baby rudimentary skill in. I'll put a link on our website on this show, episode 10, so that you can find the site and experiment with it. And next time, I'll be glad to address any of your questions. Well, that's it for today's show. We're out of time for today, but you can always continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.